On this Atari archive, the Spectra gang returns with a trio of strange concept games. Back in September 1982, and moving beyond our previously covered releases from Atari and Activision, Spectravision has brought along its second tranche of software following its inaugural June titles, Planet Patrol and Gangster Alley. Both of those games could reasonably be considered inventive, ambitious even, if a bit flawed in execution. Today's three games, Tapeworm, China Syndrome, and Crossforce, fare better in that regard, albeit to varying degrees. According to contemporary reporting, these games started shipping to stores in September, though the vast majority of early advertisements for them don't appear until October. As such, consider these likely to have debuted in that nebulous period at the end of one month into the next. Another game, The Challenge of Nexar, is also reported as shipping out in late September, but for my own sake I'm plopping that firmly as an October release to contend with later, due to a lack of any further indications as to its availability. Opening things up today, we have a rather inventive twist on the space shooter formula with Crossforce. Initially advertised under the name Crossfire right up until September, really. Crossforce puts you in control of two ships on the top and bottom of the screen. You can position these horizontally, and upon firing, they will create a beam between them that you can then use to destroy enemy ships. According to the manual, you are responsible for fending off invading morpals from the planet Zorus, using the Spectron weapon, also known as your twin guns. Amusingly, the manual places this as a direct sequel to Spectravision's Planet Patrol, even though any such linkages do not exist within the game itself. Wrapping your head around how the two guns function is where a great deal of the challenge of this game comes from. There are two game modes here, for 1 or 2 players apiece. The first, diagonal movement, will cause the upper gun to move the opposite direction of what you push for the bottom one. The other game mode, parallel movement, will keep the two of them synced up vertically. In either case, your laser shots are always going to move between the two, all while your foes are firing at both of your emplacements. The difficulty switches adjust how quickly you move on the screen, which will be a recurring trend with all three of these games. More pleasantly, this is an early game with a pause function. By flipping the color switch to black and white, the game will pause with a little animation until you flip it back up to resume. I'm struggling to think of any VCS games prior to Crossforce and its fellow release, China Syndrome, that included an intentional pause feature other than Superman's unusual feature that will cycle you around the game map while active, but it's rather welcoming to repurpose the color switch for it given how few games are still using it for its intended purpose by 1982. Once the game begins, a mothership will begin dropping off enemy morpals. These start off with the Guppoids, but as you clear waves, they'll begin sending faster and more aggressive foes. Starting in the second wave, these will be within fighter ships that, once destroyed, unleash a pair of passengers. Enemies will fire shots at both of your cannons, and upon being destroyed will occasionally fire off a revenge bullet, as though this were a Danmaku shooter from the 90s. If you manage to reach 10,000 points, you'll earn an extra Spectron gun, with up to 4 in reserve at a given time, though this is easier said than done. You'll also note there are 2 gauges to keep track of, your heat and fuel. Every time you fire your laser, the heat gauge will fill up slightly, sort of like Sega's arcade game Astro Blaster. If it overheats, you'll be stuck waiting for it to cool off a bit before you can fire again. Meanwhile, your fuel gauge is always ticking down, and if it runs out, you lose a Spectron. Occasionally, the planet Spectra will send out a refueling pack that you must shoot to top up. How easily you can do this depends on the game mode. If playing on the default diagonal mode, Crossforce is extremely difficult. Not only are you stuck trying to avoid enemy fire with the unintuitive backwards controls for your upper gun and placement, but since the guns always have to intersect, you're functionally kind of stuck always firing towards the center. This makes it hard to hit refueling packs unless they drift to the middle before disappearing, and it makes it difficult to shoot down enemies unless they too randomly move between your guns. Parallel mode plays more like a standard shooter, albeit one where you have to keep track of fire on 2 sides. The game seemed more balanced around the latter game mode, but despite that, the diagonal mode is more unique and interesting. It's just unfortunate that it doesn't feel very good to play, as you'll just randomly find yourself unable to strike anything for stretches of time. Despite this, Cross-Force is a big improvement over the flawed Planet Patrol or Too Easy Gangster Alley. It is a very solid release by Spectravision. The manual provides a handy chart of ranks based on your score, and frankly, you'd need to be a pretty solid fan of Cross-Force to surpass the lowest Purple Heart rank. Unexpectedly, Cross-Force saw a sequel of sorts. In early 1984, the company released a handful of games for the ColecoVision in fairly small quantities, and one of these was Super Cross-Force. While it resembles its predecessor, albeit with nicer graphics and no heat gauge, the real difference comes in the addition of a two-player simultaneous mode, where each player takes command of one of two ships. This allows for independent movement and makes for a more interesting game where you both have to be in communication to ensure you're lined up in a way that will destroy your foes. You could conceivably play this solo with a pair of controllers custom mounted together if you were so inclined, but it would probably be rather hard to actually keep track of what's happening at any given moment. Super Cross-Force also appears to have been released on the MSX in Japan by ASCII and in Europe by the then renamed Spectravideo. Owing to the similar hardware to the ColecoVision, these aren't particularly different. Computer Entertainer reviewed the Coleco release, giving it high marks for its visuals and unique play mechanics, though dinging it for the enemy bombs looking too similar to your lasers. Even without those enhancements, the original Cross-Force is a good time on the VCS. Its fast pace, the randomness of the revenge bullets means you can never truly let your guard down, and it can be downright intense trying to grab that fuel pack before you run out entirely. Spectravision did well with this one, and it's probably the most solidly done title of this trio. Our second cartridge of this video is an example of translating real-world anxieties into a video game. While this isn't necessarily novel, games like Missile Command and Jamie Fenton's Nuke the Expletive do the same thing but for Cold War jingoism and nuclear threats. But the subject matter here is a little unusual. In China Syndrome, you're tasked with managing a nuclear reactor that is undergoing a meltdown. This game is clearly pulling from the popular 1979 film of the same name, though it doesn't appear to be officially licensed. Rather, it's referencing the term China Syndrome, which colloquially refers to a nuclear reactor melting down, with its fuel melting through the ground all the way to China. By coincidence, the movie debuted shortly before the 3 Mile Island power plant underwent a partial meltdown, an incident that raised general anxiety around the safety of nuclear power in the United States. In the video game space, the Gottlieb game Reactor by Tim Skelly could have been a reference to this, though Skelly told historian Keith Smith in an interview that the theming came out of the non-aggressive game loop he was interested in developing rather than current events. We don't know who wrote China Syndrome, but it's likely its commercial appeal by Spectravision was to remind people of the film and to pull from 3 Mile Island. This is clear enough in the game manual, where the game describes an earthquake striking the city of Spectraville, damaging the power plant on Spectra Island and requiring you to go in and secure loose pieces of nuclear fuel before they cause a meltdown. Contemporary reporting draws the line between Spectravision's game and both the 1979 movie and the 3 Mile Island incident, so whatever indirect marketing was intended here hit its mark. Functionally speaking, China Syndrome divides the game space into 3 zones where particles will bounce around. You control the DDV robot arms that can move anywhere on the screen, and you will need to grab these particles before they bounce around too long and begin splitting. To do so, you have to just position yourself where they are bouncing and press the button to close your arms around it to capture it. After you've collected enough of them, you move on to the next wave, which will see additional particles at higher speeds and the addition of core vent fans, which will destroy your arms if touched. After successfully clearing 9 waves, you'll have reached the bottom of the reactor, as seen in the manual, ending the game and receiving an all-clear message. If you lose all your robot arms, you'll instead get to enjoy a lengthy meltdown for your game over. China Syndrome includes 4 game difficulty levels. Game 1 is described as practice, while Game 2 is the real deal, though functionally it's hard for me to parse what makes them different. That said, Game 2 is more difficult and took more tries for me to complete, so there is something to it. Game 3 starts you on the 5th stage, where the game begins getting harder, while Game 4 is for young children and tops out in challenge at level 4. The difficulty switches adjust the number of robot arms you start with and how quickly they move. You'll start each level with an extra robot arm in stock up to 9. And like Cross-Force, flipping the color switch will let you pause the game. What you wind up with in China Syndrome is a game that has an interesting concept and a unique playstyle, but also one that is either fairly easy or remarkably difficult, with very little in between. In the earlier stages, when particles are moving slowly, it's easy enough to catch them all and clear the stage without a meltdown. And even in the later stages, it remains pretty manageable as long as you keep on top of the particles. Once they begin splitting, however, it's extremely difficult to bring things back under control, so you really have to be sharp on your catches. This is especially prevalent on the final stage, where particles are moving so quickly that you're very likely to have to deal with a split if you whiff once or twice. Having a faster robot arm mitigates this somewhat, but the importance of not missing your grabs is always there. The core vents are a bigger challenge to deal with, particularly once they expand in size, since their hitbox is rather generous. But the game is still fairly easy to clear despite this. Ultimately, this feels like a game that could have used trackball support, though granted, such an accessory didn't exist on the VCS at this time, and some additional wrinkle to go with another set of stages. That said, there is no trackball hack for this game, and it's plausible that the kernel used for the game's engine doesn't really allow for it to begin with. China Syndrome isn't quite as flawed as Spectravision's earlier Gangster Alley, but it's one of the less refined games the company published. This one feels like it could have used a bit more time in the nuclear oven. Of today's games, Tapeworm is maybe the most derivative, but it comes at a point in time where that doesn't mean much. Its anonymous designer here produced an early example of the Snake game genre, with a few twists on its own. For those who may be unfamiliar, a Snake game in the modern sense is one where you play a snake or worm crawling along on the screen eating objects. Every time you eat something, you grow longer, and therefore you must avoid running into yourself for as long as possible. These became fairly popular for a while thanks to the 1998 Nokia phone game Snake, but their origins really date back to the late 70s and early 80s. Some posit that the genre got its start with Gremlin's Blockade and its subsequent clones, such as Atari Surround on the VCS, or Midway's Checkmate, games where you are trying to box in your opponent by moving around the screen, building a wall behind you that they'll crash into. While there are some similarities, it is seemingly difficult to consider these linked all that closely, save for one subsequent title, Gremlin's 1977 game Hustle. Hustle serves as a sort of intermediary state, where you control a snake grabbing as many point boxes as you can within a time limit, growing longer in length after losing a life as a penalty. Developed by Lane Houck as a game to help Gremlin clear out its stockpile of unsold blockade boards and cabinets, the game was perhaps best known for its marketing push, where Gremlin organized a 19-city tour starting in April 1977 to have people play against the Gremlin Girls, Sabrina Osment and Lynn Reed, in a high-score competition, with any winners getting $100. Reportedly, Osment and Reed defeated 1,233 challengers and only had 7 people overcome their high-score prowess. While Gremlin's tour was a success, with $1.5 million in orders, and their blockade hardware backlog cleared. We'll get back to how Hustle factors in momentarily, but suffice it to say, Snake games weren't coming to the VCS directly from the arcade. Instead, one must turn towards the computer side of gaming. The earliest Snake-like game I've come across researching this video was Arrow, created for the Commodore PET or PET in late 1978 by Jim Butterfield, a major player at the Toronto PET Users Group. A group which, I should note, is still ongoing as of this recording, and back in 2009 put out a CD with their archives up to that point. At first glance, Arrow is simply a clone of Hustle, where you're moving around the screen grabbing point boxes. But here, every time you earn 10 points, your snake grows in length. This makes Arrow the missing link, so to speak, between games like Blockade and the broader Snake game genre, as it is really the first such game that sees you growing as you eat objects. I'll also make note of Worm for the TRS-80, which is also commonly referenced in this lineage as well, even if it seems to be more of a cousin than an ancestor. Written by Peter Trefinus and distributed in the March 1979 edition of the cassette magazine C-Load, this is a fairly simple game where your worm is constantly drawing its body behind it, and you are scored by how long you can keep the game going before colliding with yourself or an obstacle. Adding a bit of strategy, you do have a gun of all things, allowing you to destroy things in front of you with one of your 5 shots. It's a neat little game, and its developer indicated in an interview with LGT Private Banking that he got the idea while coding for his TRS-80, accidentally creating a bug that caused a trail to be left behind as the object moved. It is, however, not exactly Snake-like in the same way Arrow is. The interview indicates that he wrote a pair of follow-up games, including a 2-player version and Hustle, which from the description sounds exactly like the arcade game, except you do get longer every time you eat one of the boxes. Jumping ahead a couple years, Sirius Software released Snake Byte around January 1982 for the Apple II. Written by Chuck Somerville, known especially for his later puzzle game Chip's Challenge, this is a true snake game. Your snake slithers around the screen, and every time it eats a food item, it grows longer. There are obstacles to avoid as well, but at the end of the day, you're also dodging yourself. In a Retro Gamer interview, Somerville explained that he got the idea from seeing a primitive worm-style game on a business computer at his store, which he found boring but neat enough to make his own twist on it, adding in walls and a level system. Given the Commodore PET's decidedly business computer form factor, it seems very likely that Arrow is what he spotted, though we can't rule out Trefonis's version of Hustle as well. His initial version, written in BASIC in about 30 minutes, was a hit in his college dorm, so he cleaned it up and sold it to Sirius for publishing. Snake Byte thankfully uses the keyboard instead of the paddle or analog controls, though it can take some getting used to with the absolute direction keys chosen, or the option of the clockwise or counterclockwise keys instead. That in mind, it is a snake game as we know it today. You're collecting enough apples to clear the stage while also avoiding a bop to the noggin by a plum, as well as your own tail. There's also a timer that counts along the edges of the playfield, and when it fills, extra apples appear that you need to eat to continue. For an Apple II action game, it's a pretty good one, and it wound up getting ported around to other platforms as well. Tapeworm is in many respects a direct clone of Snake Byte in several ways while putting its own little twist on the formula. First, all the similarities. You're still going through different stages, and there are obstacles to deal with as well. Instead of bouncing plums that can kill you, Tapeworm includes predators that will eat the worm, named Slinky the Spectral Worm in the manual, if they touch its head as they bop around the screen. Beaky the Bird and Spanky the Spider each have their own movement schemes that you need to be aware of, though they also have a habit of spawning in at the worst possible times. Slinky is eating beans around the screen, with each one causing you to grow in length. Once you've eaten enough beans, a fruit will spawn on the outside of the playfield, and touching it will end the stage and move you to the next one. Of special note is the mystery beetle at the bottom of the screen. It functions the same as the timer from Snake Byte. Every time a bean spawns, it begins walking to the right, and if it makes it before you eat the bean, it'll spawn 2 more beans that must be eaten to continue the stage. This includes when the fruit is on screen. If the beetle touches its own rendition of the fruit, you have 2 more beans to eat before you can clear the level. As you progress, you'll have to deal with obstacles on the playfield, as in Snake Byte, but unlike the 28 levels of the Apple II game, here you have 5 stages. The third one is fairly unique as it is set at night. You have 2 seconds to see where a bean is located before the screen goes dark again, and once you pick it up, the screen lights up for 2 more seconds. You can manually light the screen by pressing the button on the controller, but doing so consumes one of the beans you've already eaten, and doing so when you have none costs you a life. The stage is really a test of your memorization skills and is both an interesting concept and a major difficulty spike. As a clone of Snake Byte to a much cheaper but more common piece of hardware than a home computer, Tapeworm does the job reasonably well. The graphics are unimpressive and the sound unpleasant, but at the end of the day, it's Snake, and Snake is itself a pretty fun game. The game has 2 modes for 1 or 2 players apiece, which adjust how quickly your snake moves. Personally, I found the higher speed difficulties to be more entertaining, as your worm moves at a pretty good clip instead of painfully slow, but it would have been nice to have an intermediary step between the 2. Meanwhile, the difficulty switches adjust whether or not your beans are high calorie or diet, but this is another instance from Spectravision where the manual doesn't really explain what this means, and I haven't been able to parse it out either. The predator movements are a bit tricky to work around and can result in some deaths that are practically unavoidable, but that aside, Tapeworm is a pretty solid rendition of a then fairly new computer game, and doesn't even have to contend with funky keyboard controls. Of these 3 games, CrossForce was unambiguously the best reviewed. Video Games wrote that it was a dodge and shoot game with novel twists, and found it difficult but with good graphics, sound, and action. Paul Backer, writing for Electronic Fun with Computers and Games, considered it a real challenger to Demon Attack in terms of a new VCS game that's got good graphics, challenge, and is fun to play, calling it the best buy for a player's money and a worthy addition in the face of the Intellivision and ColecoVision's presence on the market. Electronic Games wrote about its refreshing difference of a second gun, noting that it requires players to pay close attention to more than just what's near the bottom. Electronic Games later gave CrossForce a certificate of merit for the 1983 Arcade Awards. China Syndrome had very few reviews in comparison, and those were not terribly strong at that. In Electronic Fun with Computers and Games, Frank Lovis gave it 2.5 joysticks, expressing his disappointment with how the particles are graphically portrayed and the difficulty of maneuvering the robot arms effectively with the joystick. Vidiot wrote about it in a dual review with Parker Brothers' Atari VCS conversion of Reactor, describing it as having similarities to Breakout in Flames and more fun than the later Parker work. As to Tapeworm, Video Game Update remarked that it was probably best suited for kids around the ages of 9 or 10, and really only recommended it for children, praising its renderings of the enemy creatures. Kim Wills gave it 2 joysticks in Electronic Fun with Computers and Games, expressing some disappointment with the visual design of the fruit and Slinky the Worm's lack of responsiveness to the controls. Logical Gamer's reviewers were mixed. Alan Bechtold found the third nighttime stage to be where the game gets interesting and captivating, with the play loop of moving around the game world eating beans compelling enough to make up for the lackluster visuals. Mike Wilson, meanwhile, appreciated the game's play but had a hard time recommending it due to how simple it is. While I don't know that Spectravision is going to be on anyone's list of top VCS publishers, I have to give them credit with this trio. CrossForce is a unique and fun game if a little flawed on its default game mode, and Tapeworm is a really solid rendition of Snake Byte within the confines of the VCS hardware. China Syndrome has a neat premise, even if the game itself falls a little flat. Spectravision's next game, Nexar, received a lot more acclaim than these three, but don't write off this portion of the publisher's 1982 software lineup. Next time, another tank-based launch game appears on the VCS.